Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and this week I have two very special guests on the podcast. I have Brian Train and Volko Ruhnke, who are game designers extraordinaire, historical game design masters. How are y'all doing today, gentlemen?
Doing very well. Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Doing great out here on the left coast.
Yes, Brian is the odd one out today because he is far from us over here in the east. So I actually brought both of you on today to talk about a specific game, which is A Distant Plane, a game that came out in 2013, correct?
That's right.
And is about Afghanistan. So would y'all like to cover just the basics of the game for people who are not familiar?
Sure. So A Distant Plane, Insurgency in Afghanistan is Volume 3 in the COIN or Counterinsurgency series. I had done a game on Colombia, Andean Abyss, 4 factions vying for the future of Colombia via insurgency and counterinsurgency. Volume 2 covered Castro in Cuba. And at that point, not only did I know Brian's design work on internal wars and insurgencies quite well, that work was actually an important inspiration for the earlier COIN games at its start. And so I called him up and proposed that we do a game together for the COIN series. And I said if he was willing to do a co-design with me, he could choose what insurgency, and he chose Afghanistan. And that design became A Distant Plane, which is 4 factions vying for the future of Afghanistan from 2001 to 2013, basically the time of design. The government, the coalition trying to fight the insurgents, the Taliban insurgents, and the warlords who are in the midst of it all, profiting from opium and trying to maintain their personal fiefdom. So it's a 4-player game that models the internal conflict and expeditionary counterinsurgency in Afghanistan at that time.
And Brian, what made you choose Afghanistan? If you had a choice of any insurgency ever, and you picked Afghanistan, so what was the draw for you?
Well, yeah, Volko certainly didn't have to ask me twice to do some work with him. I was very, very pleased to do that. I wanted to do Afghanistan because I think that it's very important to do designs on contemporary topics. I've been designing for about 25 years, and a lot of my output has been on things that are fairly recent and normally irregular war, guerrilla war, counterinsurgency, whatever you want to call it. And I thought that it was particularly important to do something on Afghanistan. I thought it was a real challenge. Volko outlined the 4 factions that are in the game. And I'm really glad that we included the 4th faction of the warlords, because not only is it adds a very necessary level of analysis and difference to the conflict by helping to describe just how multi-layered and factional and complex things are in Afghanistan. But it was also time for, I think, a recognition in game form of the role that organized crime can play in contemporary conflicts. So there is that aspect. So yeah, it was current. It was interesting. It was challenging. Yeah, it was definitely time to do something like that. I had already done a little bit of work on some other Afghanistan games, and so I thought this would be a good thing to build on as well.
So I want to go back to something really interesting you said, which is that you think it's important to design games that are about contemporary events. And in this, I would say that you are both designers who are willing to do that. Other designers that I talk to often on this podcast, such as David Thompson, for example, typically shy away from events where even people who are related to that event are still alive for fear of upsetting a family or, accidentally touching on somebody's grief because they've lost someone in a conflict. So for each of you, what is the importance of using games to model ongoing conflict that's happening now? And what are some special challenges that you think come with that territory?
Well, let me talk about the importance. I come at it as a hobby war gamer, and so why am I interested in war games? What's fun about them for me? I mean, if it was just about playing and winning in social life and that kind of thing, I could play chess or whatever. I'm actually choosing to play games that are about something. And in my case, the games I'm most interested in are the games about military history. So why are we interested in history? And I contend we're interested in history because we're trying to understand ourselves. We're trying to understand humanity and how things work. And we look at past times and past situations and try to discern our nature and how we got here. And so consequential topics are attractive, right? I want to read books about things that matter. I want to play games about things that matter. So war is like really consequential, right? It affects a lot of people, affects the shape of society, it affects what happens after that, and so forth. And if we think about recent war and war, Julius Caesar, war, 2,000 years ago, Julius Caesar's wars were highly consequential, no question. But for us, we have, it becomes even more consequential if we think about things that are recent that are affecting very directly the shape of the world that we live in. And so it would be odd to avoid, for me as a war gamer, it would be odd for me to avoid touching recent history along with the full span of history. Now I have, I'm a tourist. I like all kinds of periods, but surely it's as important for us to understand very recent wars as it is ancient wars.
And Brian, where do you come in on that? You mentioned actually in our pre-chat that you enjoy covering less common topics in your games. Do you feel the Distant Plane fell into that as well as your interest in modern conflict?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I've been playing war games for about, well over 40 years. Uh, but from the beginning, I was interested in the kind of games that people were not designing. They were not designing games on contemporary events. In the late 70s, early 80s, when I started, there were very, very few war games on Vietnam, for example. It was a topic where people didn't touch, either because it was too sensitive, or I think maybe a little bit more compellingly because they wouldn't sell. Um, after after 40 years of involvement in the hobby, I've come to the conclusion that most war gamers are probably they're very, very knowledgeable about certain periods of history, amazing depth of knowledge in certain periods, but by and large, they don't appear statistically to be any more interested in contemporary events than people who don't play war games, people who just kind of exist in the world as it is today and think that the world has always been as it is today, pretty much, and probably will continue to be pretty much as it is today. That's how most people approach history, and I've never found that satisfying. I've always been interested in contemporary events. I've always been interested in the role that politics plays in war, and all of the intangibles that go on in war. And you look at conflict over the last 75 years now, because World War II is 75 years in our past. The great majority of conflicts, the default mode, if you will, is irregular warfare, some form of insurgency. And if you're going to understand the world that you live in today, you need to inform yourself about it. And you can do that by watching movies or reading books or that sort of thing. And so when I design games on these kinds of things, it's me taking my research and distilling it and modeling it as a game and then presenting it to other people. Saying, here's my work. Maybe you can play around in my game world for a little while. More than once, somebody has said to me, I found your game so annoying that I went back and read 3 books. I didn't mind that, or I found your treatment of the war so annoying that I went back and read some books about it, and I thought that was great. kind of a backhanded compliment. But that's my feeling, about that. And I published something. I'm getting close to 60 published designs now, and a good half of them deal with contemporary conflicts. Most of them deal with irregular warfare of one kind or another. It's as we've been saying, it can be a really sensitive topic. I think it is possible to treat it in a sensitive way, and we're going to be talking about that later here. Um, so, I don't treat it as a taboo topic, but it's something that I'm personally interested in. It's something that I find fulfilling to research, model, and present it and talk about it with other people. I don't think I have any kind of didactic mission or anything like that. And we'll be talking about that again later. Still less that there's any kind of predictive value in these things. But they're good as models. And Volko has spoken, very eloquently in the past about the uses of models. So we'll probably hear some of that too. That's a leading question. It's a leading statement.
Liz, you also asked about are there special challenges if you're modeling very recent events, and I mean
Yes.
Of course there are, and there's been, I know, discussion online about that, and with regard to games like A Distant Plane, and in a challenge, a kind of a bundle of challenges comes from the recency, in that since we are all as observers alive as these things are happening, we're forming opinions, and those opinions are political in nature, given the topic. It means that we're going to have certain lenses on when we approach the topic. And when you model something, whether you're trying to describe a system in a book as a historian, or depict it in a film or a play or a game, you're making a lot of choices to what you focus on. To simplify, you can't show it all, you can't consider it all, right? And of course, game design is no different. And in those choices, your filters are going to play, right? Your biases are going to come into effect. And so we can say, well, with recency, these personal biases of the designer, the writer, whatever, are going to be more forceful than if it's about something that, well, we have 2,000 years of retrospect to, evaluate. But my contention is that you get a trade-off, but that's a sort of a challenge you got to consider in terms of, to what degree are you presenting a picture that is skewed because it's so recent, okay? But on the other hand, recent history does have some advantages in terms of, first of all, oodles of information available. Compared, now I've designed games on ancient times. When we talk about Caesar's Gallic Wars, and I co-designed a game on that in the same series, we have some archaeological evidence, we have some scattered writings, but we have like one principal author, right, who had biases and agendas writing about those wars, that is the main source of how we think those conflicts in Gaul worked, okay? And if you go to medieval military campaigns, as I'm designing in now, very often we're lucky if we have chronicles on both sides, and it's like a few paragraphs. And that, and archaeology, remaining castle ruins and things like that, and our general knowledge of the milieu, that's what we've got to work from. And even there, I will tell you that wargamers and others hold passionate views, even you could say political. If you've discussed Caesar and Gaul with a French wargamer, be ready for some potentially political views on how much to believe what that Caesar wrote about what was going on there, right? And not just French people, of course. And so it's kind of a scale for me of different topics have different amounts of information available, different numbers of historians that have weighed in on it, journalists that have weighed in on it, participants who have weighed in on it, and whatever we, as an interested observer, bring to the table. And I might bring more or less to the table considering Afghanistan in 2013 than I do considering Caesar in 52 BC, right? In both cases, I bring more than nothing to the table, which means I have views, filters, biases is kind of the negative view, but interpretations, to put it more neutrally, that we pay historians and journalists and
Not enough.
memoirists not enough, but that is kind of the point is you're not just assembling a bunch of data and saying, okay, here, you figure it out, right? You're applying your interpretations, your simplifications, your views, your biases. And so we don't want to pretend, especially with a game about a recent setting, recent events, we don't want to pretend like, oh, this is the objective fact-based, of course our biases are in it. Of course, our biases are in it. Now, we're trying to be as conscious as we can of that, right? But it's inevitable. And that's perhaps more true of a game about recent Afghanistan than ancient Gaul, but it's actually true about both.
Yeah, it's very true. War games are art, and there is no completely objective or neutral painting, book, piece of choreography, photograph, or war game. It's always because it had a creator. It has some of the creators influences that influence it, and so especially when you're making something like a war game, because you have to sift through all of your research, you have to sift through all of the factors, and you have to decide which ones are important, which ones are de-emphasized, which ones are left out completely, which ones you really want to punch up, and so that's those are the things that inform the kind of game world that you're making. So with A Distant Plain, what we really wanted to emphasize was the asymmetries between the four factions. Now, it's a hideous, overgeneralization and smoothing out to have only four factions, with the kind of action menus, asymmetric menus that we have for each side or each faction as to what they can and cannot do and how they go about doing it. So it's something that you really have to be mindful of. But I think our general response to this, when people are asking about our biases, is to say, well, look, we did our best to do our homework. We really think that this should be emphasized in the design as it is. No matter what things may appear right now, we think that maybe this aspect is less important. You have to choose. You can't throw absolutely everything into a game. You can't throw absolutely everything into your novel or your painting or whatever. You have to use some discretion. Because these are the things that you choose in showing your idea and showing your interpretation, your thesis, if you will. And again, it doesn't have to have a didactic mission. It doesn't have to say, look, this is the way it is. This is our model. This is the definitive model. This is going to tell you what's going to happen. No, we never claimed anything like that.
I want to press you right there. So you've said twice now in this conversation that you want to be seen as having no didactic mission. However, every game is a statement about something of some kind. So if you weren't looking to provide a definitive model, what were you hoping that people who played A Distant Plain would take away from it?
We wanted to show, above all else, the asymmetry between the different factions and the layers of complexity in the conflict. I think we've really succeeded in that. And we've succeeded in doing that for the period of time that the game covers, from 2002 or 3 to about 2013 or 2014, the time that we published the game, but also the time that NATO finished its combat mission in Afghanistan and reverted to a more of a training and support role. And yeah, I'm sorry. When I say didactic, I mean in a sort of sort of pejoratively in a sort of like whack you over the head with a piece of board kind of way. I'm when I say didactic, I mean sort of like very obstreperous, very forceful about, this is the way. But what we did, like, for example, what we did in showing our homework in a distant plane is, this is one of the few war games that has a reading list. There's a full page bibliography in there of all kinds of sources that we used for the event cards, and just showing how we put together, the mechanisms that the four factions have. We have footnotes, or rather citations, for each of the event cards that are reproduced in the playbook. So if something happened, we do have a citation for it. There are some cards for some things that didn't happen, like a coup d'etat, for example, in Afghanistan. Not in 1975, but in the period of the game. But they could have happened, and so we talk about that as well. So what we do is we create this model. It's not the model. It's not a strict mirroring of history. It has some bounds that people play within, but everybody, when they step into that magic circle, that they talk about, people agree to be bounded by that magic circle. And so, that's.
Let me give you an example of something I think A Distant Plane tries to show or explain through its simplified asymmetries, okay, that Brian mentioned. So a question that might need to be answered, looking at Afghanistan 2013 now, is we have a coalition of some of the world's most sophisticated military, economic, technological powers. NATO is such a powerful alliance. The United States leading, a superpower. And you would think that if it's committing itself to goals in Afghanistan with troops on the ground and billions in treasure, that it's just going to come in and sweep away whatever the resistance is and establish whatever situation it wants, which clearly was not happening. Why not? Right? That's sort of a question. And so a part of the answer, why not, goes back to insurgency and counterinsurgency always being multifactional. And these factions matter. Everybody has different objectives. And if you come in as a counterinsurgency force from outside, you have to form alliances with locals who have different views of what the future should be than maybe what you want to provide there. And there's a particular challenge if you're a counterinsurgency force that doesn't want to just live there. So, Roman governance of Gaul, ultimately, they wanted to add that to the empire, right? They want to live there. Colombia, its government, which successfully conducted a counterinsurgency effort over the 90s and early 2000s, depicted in the first game, well, they live there, right? They're not, what is it that the expeditionary counterinsurgents want? And this was just a simplification that I'm kind of proud of in A Distant Plane. We had to boil down in these games what each faction wants down to one or two simple victory conditions, because it's a board game. What are the players trying to do to win, right? And they're all different. And we decided for the coalition in Afghanistan, they want to do two things. They want to convince the people of Afghanistan to support the government in Kabul. Why? Because they're there to establish a legitimate, friendly, accountable, competent government, right? That in legitimacy means you need the support of a lot of the people who live there and saying, yeah, that's our government, right? We give you normative sanction to rule over us, right? So that's one thing the coalition is trying to do. And it's a very typical counterinsurgent thing to do, right? Get the hearts and minds of the people to support the government. Okay, but what's the second thing they want? To leave, right? To get out of there, especially to get your troops out of there, right? And so if you're playing as the coalition in a distant plane, you're trying to do what you can to shift popular support, not to support you, the coalition, but to support the government, who's a different faction. Okay. And you're trying to get your troops out. And of course, the way that you affect affairs on the ground is with your troops. So now you've got, right away in the victory condition of that player, you've got a dilemma. Because you score points. It costs you points to have your troops there. You score points by getting your troops out. But the way you get stuff done is with your troops. Okay? And so now you see you're off to the races. Okay. So now in the real world, imagine that situation. You're everybody else. You're the people who do live there. The government and its supporters, the warlords, whatever. You all know that the coalition's objective is what? To leave. Hopefully, from the coalition's point of view, soon. Now that makes it a little bit tough as the coalition, right, to get anything done in convincing everybody, because they all know that you're not going to, one day you're just not going to be there, right? And that's a big problem. So that's sort of an inherent dilemma, the multifactional aspect that you're working in, and the fact that you're temporary as an influence there. That's just going to work against you as a counter-expeditionary insurgent all the time. We saw it in Vietnam, and we saw it in Afghanistan. So we put that in the game, and I think that has something to say also. It's not prediction of anything, but it does illustrate, right, what the U.S. and the coalition are up against. And a final aspect, the government in the game, asymmetrically, has a completely different victory condition. They actually don't care that much about popular support. They want to have control of the population through, forces and security forces around the country. And then they want to do what they've always been doing, and that is to extract resources to reward their friends, to provide patronage, because that's the way they maintain their political control, and that's why they're there. You could be unkind and say that's corruption, but that's kind of the manner of governance that was traditional among these kinds of elites, which, by the way, works directly against the coalition objective of making the government popular and legitimate. So you end up with, on its face, the government and the coalition are partners against the Taliban, and sometimes against the warlords and sometimes not, okay? But it's a bad marriage, right? Because there are, and this is, Brian's phrase at the time, perverse incentives kind of built into the structure. And so the model that simplifies these perverse incentives as asymmetrical victory conditions tries to bring that to life, right? Tries to at least explain why is it that it's so hard for these two, the coalition and the government, who have so much military force, to make things happen, to settle affairs in Afghanistan.
So it's really interesting that you bring up this specific set of conflict topics up, right? Because it's obviously relevant for today. But before we talk about this year, so you both mentioned sort of having a model that went from about 2002 up until about 2013, kind of maybe going to 2014. Would you say a year ago that the general situation modeled in your game still held up with time, and it was still a fairly accurate reflection of what was going on in Afghanistan?
Maybe I got maybe two things I just wanted to say, just in reaction to what Volko was saying and in response to your question. When Volko was talking about the victory conditions in the game, there's a way that in the coin system, there's like 10 or 13 volumes in the system now. There's a way the victory conditions are structured, which makes it work mechanically. There are always two victory conditions for each faction in these games. One is a dependent victory condition. The other one is independent. So Volko talked about coalition, for example. On the one hand, they want to build what on the map is marked as a support state, different areas having support for government, and also about reducing the footprint and keeping minimum number of forces in the country. So the one is the condition of support is your dependent one, because it's something that somebody, in this case the Taliban, opposes by setting up opposition to the government. So that is something that is in opposition to what somebody else wants. And then there's the independent condition, which is removing yourself from the theater of conflict. And that's what drives the dynamics in these coin system games. It's not just the difference in means and methods among the different factions, whether it's a game for 2 factions or 3 or 4, as we have in the system now. But that's what drives the interactions, and serves up the dilemma for each player when they sit down and they think, okay, I've got to treat my own victory conditions, but I also have to think about what is going to be happening to the other people. I think that's a really, really clever, brutally simple, but really clever part of the whole system, and really gives the flavor of a Distant Plain and so many other games in the system. The other part I wanted to talk about was when Volko was talking about the term legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Legitimacy and how different factions view legitimacy. And I've been thinking, that the political leadership of the coalition, not the military leadership, but the political leadership of the coalition, viewed legitimacy in a different way. For them, and the people that they respond to in civilian government and the media and that sort of thing, legitimacy in Afghanistan, if I can be really overgeneralizing, meant to what extent can we make Afghanistan resemble the West? Legitimacy through the ballot box, legitimacy through human rights and advancement of women's rights and treatment of ethnic minorities, these kinds of things. When the other factions on the ground there viewed legitimacy in a very different way, a sort of realpolitik kind of way, because the legitimacy of a government depends on the consent of the governed. That's a very basic principle of political science. And if you can establish yourself as the guarantor of relatively neutral disposition of arguments and local conflicts, property rights, the dispenser of justice, the giver of stability, then people will accept you as the government. It doesn't matter, whose names are on the ballot box or anything. So it's that difference in vision of where a government's legitimacy comes from. I think that was like a fatal division in the vision of these countries in opting to intervene in Afghanistan, for whatever reason. And as for the state of Afghanistan after 2013, 2014, before we came on the podcast, we were talking about how suddenly there's been this eruption, of popular media interest in Afghanistan after more or less ignoring it for the last 8 years, and people being and acting very surprised over the outcome. But over the years, the last few years, people have been asking me, well, how does a Distant Plain reflect what's going on right now? And I have to say, that it really doesn't. The kind of conditions that have changed in the political calculus and over the last 8 or 9 years are just, they could be very crudely mirrored in the game, but by and large they require thoughts and actions by the players that really are outside of the game itself. So I was trying to construct some similes for this, recently on social media and stuff, people talking about a Distant Plain. And basically, I said, it's at the time, it's as if the coalition player stood up after several hours of playing the game and said, okay, the last bus home is 10:45. I got to be on it. This is my copy of the game, so we got to fold it up and go. Meanwhile, the government player, he's got to get up early tomorrow. So he's not really interested in playing the game as the game is structured anymore. So you got two players who aren't really, who in a meta sense are not so interested in playing the game anymore. So as often happens at the end of a satisfying night of games, everybody's there, shuffling the pieces on the board and tucking them back in the Ziploc bags and throwing them back in the box because you got to make the bus. That's kind of a metaphor, a very crude metaphor for this sudden collapse, this catastrophic failure of morale on the part of the government. Now, I've designed other games on insurgencies where the currency for either side is, political support. It's an index of political support, for want of a better term. But there's so many other things that are rolled up in it. And when one side zeroes out in that system of games, that's some catastrophic failure of interest or morale or support or legitimacy or however you want to classify it in that game. Game over. The other side won. It's because somebody zeroed out. That's something that's not part of the coin system, because the way the coin system works is you have a campaign where people play their way through a variable number of turns, and then you have a propaganda round, which is kind of an interstice between campaigns. And the first thing you do in a propaganda round is you judge, okay, has someone fulfilled their winning conditions? And so to look at it historically, during the period of that game, nobody fulfilled their winning conditions.
Right.
So the game, it ended up with no clear winner in 2013. There's a clear winner now, but it's a completely different type of game with completely different out-of-game frame events have happened. And if we're going to be playing a game about Afghanistan now, as I've written a couple of times, we need a game on winning the peace. About consolidating and it's maybe if people want to learn something about Afghanistan as it is now, I would suggest maybe some kind of game about consolidating, a regime. Now, people would debate whether this is even a war game, because there are hardly any war games that talk about the victory conditions that you set up for when the shooting stops. How well positioned are you to do that? There was a computer game I played a long time ago called Hidden Agenda. It's an old Mac game, and it was modeled on Nicaragua. And so you are in the position of being, the head of a new government that has just overthrown an old regime. You're looking to put your stamp on the government. You're looking to fill a power vacuum. And of course, the challenge in the game is people keep coming to you, with ideas and problems and these kinds of things. Now, depending on who you placate or ignore or punish, that kind of pens you in as the game goes on, and you find yourself more and more the victim of your own internal contradictions and good and bad choices, and you try and navigate your way through that. There are no war games like that, or there are very few games like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that would be a very interesting aspect. A while ago, Vesa Arponen put out a volume in the coin system on the Finnish Civil War of 1918. So this is an armed struggle that took place over maybe just 4 or 5 months. But its after effects can be felt 100 years later, and just being able to, and it was one of the volumes in the game system where you have a faction that is interested in creating good conditions for political stability and political, discussion and movement and progress after the war is over. So they have an interest that's outside of winning the war. They have a different vision of how to win the war.
So I think that even a year ago, right, you might pick up a distant plane to kind of help understand Afghanistan as it was in 2019, because it really kind of felt like we were just over there forever. But now the sort of America has withdrawn, the Taliban have taken over, that sort of push-pull condition that is required for a coin game to work is gone. So how do you feel that impacts the continuing relevance of a distant plane for gamers?
So let me, and I'll kind of wrap that into my answer to your last question about, to what degree did it remain the model
Mhm.
relevant or coherent for Afghanistan after 2013? And I'll be a little bit kinder to the model perhaps than Brian is. Um, the relevance in both cases comes from the fact that it is intended as a historical game. It's recent history, yes, but it is not predictive. And it is, as Brian has said, about 2001 to 2013. And most coin games and the ones that we were doing at that time come out of this idea that there are long running internal wars. Colombia was going on, the insurgency in Colombia was going on decades before the moment in time that you start when you play Andean Abyss, and it continued after, right? So it's like you're taking that slice, and that's the way it's built. Later games in the series, Pendragon is one. All Bridges Burning by Vesa that Brian mentioned is one. Do look at transformations and transitions and that kind of thing. But the premise
Right.
in most coin games is if somebody achieves their victory conditions, they've just kind of pushed things far enough that it's probably they've got the momentum and that's where it's going to end up. It doesn't actually then model the actual revolution or the actual collapse or the actual victory of the government or anything like that, right? So that is a limitation, but that is appropriate to this is Afghanistan 2001 to 2013. When I look at what happened after
Right.
2013, I think the model still worked because we had put in the coalition player has the freedom to put in a huge surge of forces larger than historically, or take every single coalition unit out. You can anywhere in between. The incentives are built in such a way that you're managing between those two extremes, but you could do that, right? And it would work. And so what happened after 2013, 2014, we go down to a lower level. They're less active to keep casualties low. You absolutely can do that in the game. And the other incentives continue to interact. The game does not cover, okay, now the coalition player has left the table and etc. Right, as Brian described. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. That's sort of outside of scope. There is an aspect, though, that I think, as I look back on the model, that I think is everything's simplified, but is oversimplified. Is simplified to such a degree that it was maybe deceptive. And I don't think we knew that then, or at least I didn't, but we can kind of conclude it now. And this is true in several other coin series games. And it comes down to not just that you have to simplify, but you have to, in a historical simulation, give players historical incentives, right? You have to kind of show if you ask a player to represent Julius Caesar, you kind of have to show the world on the game board the way Julius Caesar would have seen it.
Right.
Otherwise, the player does not fulfill the role of driving the model as the historical actors did. So that's tricky in counterinsurgency if it's based on theories that you later on decide, well, maybe this theory didn't apply so well in Afghanistan, let's say. So in the game, in a distant plane, if you're the coalition, you can act on the theory that if you control an area, provide security to the people, and give them governance, do good stuff for them, including good work, schools and sewers and roads and education and all that you spend resources on them for their civic interest in an operation called civic action, that eventually they start liking you. Okay. And if it's if you're helping the government do that, eventually they start liking the government. So in the game, you can put your units somewhere, control that province, spend resources, and generate support for the government in that way. In retrospect, did that happen in Afghanistan? Did that theory hold there? We, the coalition, spent a lot of resources doing that kind of thing. At the end of the day, how much support did it earn for the government? It's at least open to question.
Right.
Whether even when you admit in the game that that's a simplification, is it one that is illuminating or actually fanciful and misleading, right? Now,
Right.
you still end up, in my view, with a relevant tool, because this is how we examine questions like that. We build models to represent complexity, and then we see, well, how are these models not so good? What's wrong with them? Can we refine them? Let's say we make that, instead of automatically generating support, you need a die roll, or you have the conditions are more stringent. Now what happens? And you can play it out. So it's still relevant if what we want to do is to understand recent history. We want to understand what was happening. How did things work in this complex system that was the counterinsurgency in Afghanistan? And is that relevant to look back in retrospect and try to understand what was going on there? Sure it is. Sure it is. Because we'd like to, I would think, not be in that situation again. Or if unfortunately we are in that situation again, we'd like to be more effective or figure out how to get out in a better way or something, right? It's consequential. And if it's consequential, we want to understand it, and games help us do that.
Yeah, if I've given the impression that this game is irrelevant to now or inappropriate to now, let me walk that back a little bit, because the historical trends, the historical factors, that we put into the game, they existed before the NATO intervention, and they exist now, and they're going to continue to exist, a long time in the future. We're it's an interesting point that you do raise about theories. I don't know, Liz, if you've ever done any kind of a discussion with anybody with the designers of Twilight Struggle. Twilight Struggle is a game where the domino theory is something that works. In reality, we know it does not work, and it's a discredited theory. But to the people who acted at the time, during the Cold War itself, they acted as if it worked, and therefore it's a mechanic in the game. It's important to remember that while you're playing the game, in that it's not quite a model of how things actually rolled out during the historical Cold War that we all lived through. But it's an important incentive, and it's an important understanding. Population-based counterinsurgency, the clear, hold, build doctrine. That's something that comes from a way back. The American approach to counterinsurgency was informed by the French approach to counterinsurgency from the Algerian War. And I had a chance to design work on that with Colonial Twilight. And even in Colonial Twilight, I talk about the influence of those theorists on American doctrine that they tried to pursue in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think it's debatable as to whether that form of counterinsurgency was actually seriously ever implemented in Afghanistan. It certainly wasn't done consistently. Does it disprove the theory? I don't know. I think the jury is still out on that. Yeah. But one final thing, and again, here we are talking about victory conditions, because the game not only has bounds in time, but it also has bounds in It also has bounds in space. Every wargame map has an edge. And so you always bump up against the edge of the world. In this game, it's possible for the coalition to win a victory because the space of the game is finite.
Right.
If you want to play and play and play and play, it's debatable whether the coalition could really win, that kind of victory. It can fulfill its victory conditions, at that time as it understands them. Right. And for game purposes, that's what you've got. But that's a limitation of the medium of games themselves, is that at some point...
Well, it's a limitation of models.
Oh, it's a limitation of models. And yes, and games are models. At some point, there is a last bus. You got to be on it.
Yeah. So let me illustrate that, in terms of time bounding. So you could play a game of a distant plane, and the coalition could win by establishing just enough support in Afghanistan for the government and getting out its troops and timing that withdrawal, that drawdown, so that when the propaganda card comes up, the coalition has met its victory condition, game over, right, and won. Now, in real life, what does that represent? Does it represent Afghanistan stable? No, not at all. It represents a U.S. administration getting out of Afghanistan and pulling its NATO partners and coalition out at a time when it seems like an honorable peace, because there's an appearance of stability, because there's enough support for the government in Kabul. But what happens the next
Right.
month and the next year and the next 10 years? The coalition's not there. Again, you're up against that same dilemma. Does that government sustain itself?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it does. That's kind of a part of the mission, is you want to set up, as the outsider, this sustainable, friendly, accountable government, right? And maybe it does. And maybe it doesn't at all. Maybe it falls apart the next year. It doesn't matter. The coalition player has still won, because that's the time bounding that's implied in that victory condition. I don't think that's necessarily unrealistic, but again, we have to keep in mind we're playing 2001 to 2013, and within that scope, within that bound, within Afghanistan itself, never mind the rest of the world, more or less, the geographic boundary that Brian was mentioning, you have certain incentives, and you're trying to outperform, your competitors towards those incentives, at least a little bit.
And that's exactly the approach that Volko and Mark Herman took in Fire in the Lake. The game ends in 1972, correct?
Right.
Not 1975. And there's a
Right.
reason why.
Yep.
Interesting. I actually think this kind of ties back to some of the unique challenges of games that that have a more contemporary setting, because I think the fact that World War II is over, for example, right? Like, we know how it turned out. I think it makes the gaminess of a World War II game shine a little bit more, in the sense that it's like, well, I know what really happened, but we've got two people who are going to see if we can replay history, or we'll see what the conditions were for that victory to occur. And that's true of Julius Caesar or whatever as well. But then you have something that people, something like A Distant Plane, y'all had a time bound on it, like an idea of limitation, right? But I think that because it was something that we are all still living, that maybe I think the expectations for that game changed, not because of anything that anybody did, but because it's like an inability to separate a game about a set of years from what happens a decade later. Like,
I think you're absolutely right, Liz. And that distinction, I think, is deceptive. Because if we look at World War II games, strategic World War II games, strategic World War II in Europe, for example, or the Pacific, very often they're time bounded to the historical dates, either exactly or more or less. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to beat history, right? We know how history went. You're trying to, if you're the Allies, you're trying to conquer the Axis powers quicker than was historically the case. Or if you're the Axis, you're trying to hold out longer. And so you get a situation where the German player wins the game if Berlin remains unconquered in 1946. Now, what does that represent? That is not a victory, right? That is just, okay, we made it past that time bound of the game, and hooray, we win. But that's not what Germany was going for in World War II. They weren't trying to just hold out to 1946. And so, we just run into time ends. There's an edge of map, and so we have to bound our model. And that is true therefore of all simulation games. Those boundaries are simplifications, as it's true of any model.
So, kind of to wrap up, would either of you ever design a game about Afghanistan again, taking into account more recent events after they've had some time to develop? Or do you feel like you made your statement about what was up in 2013 and you're done?
I think I described the kind of game that I'd like to design about Afghanistan now. One about, one player has swept the board. That game's over. Now it's time for another game. As despicable a regime as the Taliban are, as awful as they are now the government, and they broke it. They bought it. Now they got to deal with it. I think would be interesting. Maybe not this particular situation, but I think it might be interesting to have to try and derive a type of game about winning the peace, about establishing a stable regime. Maybe one that doesn't always have regular elections or elections at all, but something about power. We have some political games, Euro games, that deal with party politics and factions and power and holding on to power. So those are some signposts. But I think maybe something about dealing with a power vacuum. A few years ago, I designed a game about a very thinly disguised post-Chavez Venezuela, and the strong man has departed from power. Now you have a power vacuum with all these factions, and they're dueling, to gain and keep ultimate power. And how do you go about that? I think that's an interesting subject for political military gaming. Doesn't count any rivets. It doesn't deal with gun calibers or anything like that. But those are the kinds of problems that I think we can use. Partly some war game mechanics and some Euro game mechanics to work out. As for designing games about Afghanistan, I've done 4, including A Distant Plain. I wouldn't design a military game about Afghanistan now, because the military contest is over, at least for now. But something that, but something about getting and keeping the peace, keeping a regime, is interesting. Again, it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, just as A Distant Plain was not everyone's cup of tea, obviously.
Right. I think especially because in this case, that would mean playing the Taliban, correct?
Well, that was an interesting thing that we went into way back when, in 2012, when it was first announced that there was going to be a game about Afghanistan on Board Game Geek. Volko, you remember this. There was a thread that petered out around after about 150 posts of all kinds there weren't any pictures of anything. Nobody knew anything about the game, but everybody had an opinion because it was Board Game Geek, including the guy who chimed in about 2/3 of the way through to tell us all that he had no interest in Afghanistan and no intention of buying the game. So there, but that's Board Game Geek for you. But there was some interesting discussion on that thread once the Moonbats had gone away about the ethics. Ethics. I don't know if that's the right word of playing the Taliban. I think at the time I said, and I still say, I think it's necessary to acknowledge the nature of all parties that are involved in the conflict, because otherwise you just set them up as some kind of silly straw man. You don't learn anything about the conflict by having some kind of faceless enemy, just some collection of blank pixels that you knock over. That doesn't help. It doesn't mean that you sympathize, obviously, but it's necessary to reach a level of understanding as to just why that even exists in the first place. And games provide us with a good way of trying to get that insight.
Awesome. Volko, any thoughts to add on this matter?
Well, you asked would I ever do another game on Afghanistan. I very much doubt I will do one on 21st century Afghanistan, but the main reason is because the world is so wide and the historical record is so long, and I like to go here and then there, and there are so many troughs to fill in the repertoire of historical games that I do feel I've done my part for modern insurgency, and I happen to be interested in medieval warfare at the operational level right now, and that's going to consume me for some years to come, and some other things. So it's not any bad reaction necessarily to current events or anything like that. It's just a matter of personal interest in places I haven't visited yet.
Yeah, and I've described the kind of game that I would do, but I'm not going to do something like that. I don't have the level of research or knowledge to do anything like that. But if I were to, that's how I would go about it. I don't know. Volko, maybe you could come back to Afghanistan with Alexander or Timur.
Wouldn't rule it out.
Fantastic. So for now, I will look forward to future amazing games from both of you. And let's do just the where we can find y'all online. Volka, where can you be located on the internet if people have questions or comments for you?
I spend too much time on Twitter at Volko26.
Excellent. What about you, Brian?
I don't twit or tweet or twit. I have a game design blog on WordPress, and I'm just putting in the URL for that now. Anybody who wants to have a look or talk, they can find me there. I'm also on Board Game Geek and Consum World.
Excellent. All right, check the show notes for that link, everybody. I, of course, can be found anywhere on the internet as Beyond Solitaire. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming on and having this discussion with me.
Thank you, Liz.
Thanks. Been great.
Hopefully all of you listeners out there enjoyed it too. Either way, happy gaming.